Deborah, and welcome to everybody. Last year, Jonathan Sachs spoke in the House of Lords about the Warsaw Ghetto. He said, "I've just returned from a conference in Warsaw. It's a city I don't know well, and I was shaken to discover that the Warsaw Ghetto was pretty much in the center of town, with its 9-foot-high walls topped with barbed wire, holding 400,000 Jews. Its existence must be known by everyone in Warsaw." In November 1940, 80 years ago this month, the Warsaw Ghetto was officially sealed, cutting off 380,000, 400,000 Jews from the rest of the world. It was the largest ghetto in Nazi-occupied Poland. When the ghetto was finally separated from the rest of Warsaw, writes Bryan Cheyette in his new book, The Ghetto, it covered 452 acres and was surrounded by 11 miles of roughly built wall. 30% of Warsaw's population were jammed into 2.5% of the city. Professor Bryan Cheyette has helped change our understanding of Jewish literature, but perhaps especially the representation of Jews in English literature, especially in books like The Constructions of the Jew in English Literature and Society and Between Race and Culture. And we're going to be talking about his new book, The Ghetto, in the very short introduction series published by OUP, in particular about the Warsaw Ghetto, but also the whole history of the ghetto, from Venice to the post-war Black American ghettos in New York and Chicago. Bryan, what was the purpose of the Nazi ghetto? What did they think they would achieve by building these ghettos?
They didn't. The ghetto changed over time, and the purpose of the ghetto changed over time. They occupied Poland and also the Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, and they found that they were ruling over more than 3 million Jews in Poland, especially. Germany had about 500,000 Jews. So they needed to find a way of, the Nazis needed to find a way of managing them. There was a debate within the Nazi hierarchy. So Heydrich, for instance, was completely against the idea of ghettoizing Jews. And in fact, the word ghettoization was not used by the Nazi authorities. They began to use the word ghetto quite late, really in the late 1930s. So there was not a policy of ghettoization. It was not a top-down decision. It was much more left to the regional and local authorities to manage the Jewish population in some way. And they did this by essentially sealing Jews into places where they already lived. So it wasn't that they thought that they would build new ghettos. Jews already, Warsaw was the center of Jewish cultural life, was by far the largest population in Poland. Łódź, as well, where the second largest ghetto was built, had already a large Jewish population. And they really didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know how many people would live there. They didn't know what the purpose of the ghetto was for. There was an argument within the Nazi authorities. The more extreme Nazis simply saw them as attritional. They saw Jews were subhuman, concealing them, sealing them into a ghetto would be just simply a way of speeding their death. Others, though, saw that slave labor was needed, labor was needed for the military effort, for the German economy in general, and wanted those in the ghetto and to be what we call work ghettos. And the Lodge Ghetto, the Łódź Ghetto, was by far the best example of a work ghetto.
But even in Warsaw, you say at one point there were 30 factories and nearly 2,000 businesses.
Yes, that is true. And Warsaw became a work ghetto, but it became, and it had an aspect of a work ghetto. But but all of this happened after the mass transportation and the mass deportation to Treblinka, where 250,000 Jews were deported out of Warsaw in 10 weeks in the second half of 1942.
So the Germans, so the Germans invade Poland September 39,
yeah,
but they don't seal the ghetto off until November 1940, 14 months later.
exactly.
And why the delay?
Largely because there was not, as I say, a policy of ghettoization as such. There was all kinds of debates, and with Warsaw it was even more extreme than Lodz. So Lodz was sealed in January 1940. So that was the first large regional ghetto. They were called regional ghettos, where a lot of smaller ghettos in the end, Jews from smaller towns were deported to these larger regional ghettos. Now, in the case of Warsaw, there's a large number of reasons why it took time. One, because there was no general policy. Two, because Hans Frank ruled Warsaw from Krakow. So you had the German authorities in Krakow with one set of plans and criteria. You then had the local authorities with another. The ghetto, as I said, was enormous, 460,000. This was the largest Jewish ghetto at any time in history. 11 miles of wall. Over 100,000 Poles had to be deported out of where the Warsaw Ghetto was eventually planned to be, and nearly 140,000 Jews were deported into this area. So the logistics were astonishing. That even though this was a place where Jews were given starvation diets, because of the debate with some Nazis simply wanting this to be a place where Jews died, others wanted it to be a place where Jews could work and aid the German economy. And the local authorities in particular knew that they needed help with the economy. Because no one actually knew what the purpose was for, it took a long time to resolve. If you needed people to work there, then you had to build places where they could work. You needed all kinds of infrastructure. You needed to build the wall, apart from anything. You needed to decide where the ghetto would be, and that took a long time. So
it was, as Rabbi Sachs said, it was in the center, near the center of the city.
Yes, yes. It's actually hard to tell now. I was fortunate enough to tour Warsaw with Janina Bauman, who was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, and she knew exactly where it was and where the wall should be, but there's obviously nothing there now, absolutely nothing. There are a few remnants, and that's about it. But yes, at the time, it was very visible. It was impossible not to know when Jews were being deported, when there were raids on the ghetto, when Jews were trying to escape, many successfully, others not. It was impossible not to know from the outside what was happening.
And the only advantage really of it being in the center was that it meant that black marketeers could bring a lot of food into the ghetto because rations were so tiny, otherwise people were just starving.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is very different to Lodge. Lodge was sealed and tight and was ruled from the center by Rumkowski, who didn't allow smuggling in of any kind. The Warsaw Ghetto, though was much more decentered. The Judenstaat didn't rule from the center. There were other forms of authority, black marketeers, political groups of all kinds. So it's much more laissez-faire. Also, the wall surrounding Warsaw had many cracks, many ways in which you could move in and out of the ghetto. And those that were the most successful smuggling in food were children. So child smugglers were first among anyone else. They were obviously controlled by black marketeers, but there were many. There were poems written to children child smugglers, stories written about them. They were incredibly important because the rations were starvation rations. If you didn't smuggle in food, and it's reckoned by people, by the people who were writing diaries and noting what was happening in the ghetto, that 80% of food was smuggled in. And without that, there would be even more of a mass starvation than there was. And there was enough starvation and people dying on the streets in Warsaw. But that prevented even more deaths.
So presumably one of the other consequences of that was that the black marketeers were making a lot of money. So you had some people in the ghetto who had a lot of money, I don't know what proportion, and of course many, many, many who were starving, didn't have access to bathrooms, running water, and were desperately poor.
Oh, absolutely. It was even worse than that, that when Rumkowski visited, he was appalled. I mean, he ruled Lodz with a rod of iron. He was a kind of mini dictator, and so did have welfare provision for Jews, and everything was centralized, including rationing. In Warsaw, it was completely different. So you had very plush cafes and restaurants with black marketeers and other wealthy individuals eating, and literally outside on the street, people were either dead, and there were many unburied bodies on the streets, or dying. So it was there was extremes in wealth, and in those who were doing quite well out of the ghetto, and those who simply were starving to death. And Rumkowski was appalled at this, but that was the way that Warsaw was run. In the end, it was to its advantage, I think, because without it, you could not have had the resistance which you eventually had.
And you mentioned earlier that Treblinka was the nearest death camp, and most of the people killed from the Warsaw Ghetto were sent to Treblinka. What do we know about what people in the ghetto knew about Treblinka? Did they know about Treblinka? Did they know about the extermination process? And when did they start to find out?
There was a group in the Warsaw Ghetto called Oneg Shabbos, run by Emanuel Ringelblum. There was about 60 people as part of that group. They met secretly. They documented, there was two forms of documentation. So there was an internal form of documentation where they were documenting the ghetto itself. And all kinds, any activity was documented. So there were cultural activities, theatre, music, all the programs were documented. Schools, school reports were all documented. Documents from different political groups. They were full of professional people, so the psychological health of people in the ghetto, economic differences. They really documented the ghetto life meticulously. And Ringelblum himself had a PhD on medieval Warsaw, Jewish medieval Warsaw. And quite a number of Jews who were ghettoized were very, very knowledgeable about early ghettos. The other thing they did, though, to answer your question, is that they smuggled people out of the ghetto so that they could report on the way Jews were being exterminated, the way that local towns were being destroyed and Jews moved into Warsaw. But also they documented the death camps of all kinds. And quite often they managed through mainly through working with the Polish resistance to get these documents to London. And these first-hand eyewitness accounts were sent to London, but at best it didn't influence military policy, but some of these reports ended up on the BBC World Service, and Ringelblum heard reports based on his own comrades' first-hand accounts.
And many of our audience, of course, will remember the moving testimony of Jan Karski in Claude Lanzmann's film Shoah, where he describes how he was smuggled into the ghetto and then went to America to try and alert the American government and so on. And
Yes.
Talking of Shoah, one of the curious things about that film is that it ends with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, not in 1945, but in 1943 with the Ghetto Uprising. Do you know why he finished his film there, ends his film there?
Yes. The uprising is tremendously important. I think less as an event, but more the way that more as a symbolic event than an actual event, let's say. It symbolized Jewish resistance, and there was all kinds of Jewish resistance, much of which was not documented because when the Nazis were through Operation Belarusa moved into Eastern Poland and the Soviet Union, there was a lot of ghettoization then and lots of forms of resistance in the Soviet Union especially. There was less forms of resistance in the Polish ghettos. There was some, but far less. But we talked about the visibility of the Warsaw Ghetto, and the armed resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto was seen by the whole of the Polish population. It filled them with hope, and they followed up with their own form of resistance about a year later. But we have to remember that the resistance came after the mass deportation. So out of 460,000 Jews, there were only 60,000 left after the mass deportations. Of those 60,000, virtually the vast majority were aged between 20 and 50. Very few children, mainly men. The rationing was much better for all kinds of reasons, but I think they were able. The groups that were left became organized. They could smuggle in a lot more food. They also took control of the ghetto. So they shot Jewish policemen that collaborated with the mass deportations. They went to the Judenrat and at gunpoint gained taxes from the money to buy arms and to organize properly. There was a dress rehearsal in January 1943 where the Germans came into the ghetto, but they started a form of resistance, killed over a dozen German soldiers, and this was the first time that German soldiers had been killed. And this was considered, this gave the people who were organizing, and this was the early stage of organizing resistance, but it gave them great hope. And after that, they, as I say, they got a lot of money. They could buy arms from the Polish resistance. all kinds of military weapons. They could organize. They knew that it was a mistake to directly confront the German army, and they didn't. Obviously, it was less than 1,000 people. They certainly couldn't confront tanks and well-armed German soldiers. So they bunkered down. They found all kinds of places where they could attack German soldiers and then go back into a bunker, which was largely what they did. And they held out, this was in April 1943, for a month. So this was the German army that had just invaded the whole of the European continent and had just invaded Eastern Europe. So this was equivalent to in miniature, a Jewish Stalingrad. And the Polish population couldn't believe that for a month, Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, starving, without any kind of infrastructure, were holding off the German army. And they had to bring back generals from the Eastern Front to, in the end, organize the German army so that they could end the resistance. But by that stage, the resistance had entered mythology. It was an extremely important world event. And to answer your question, Landsman is a Zionist. He wants Jews to enter history. He wants Jews to be active, to have agency, to take control. And that's what the resistance represented.
One of the most fascinating statistics in your book is that there were over 1,000 ghettos at one point in the Nazi Empire. Were there any kinds of similarities, or were they just so worse? There's many differences.
There were all kinds of differences, from propaganda. So Theresienstadt was a propaganda ghetto, which was used. The Nazis simply said, well, we're just returning Jews to the medieval ghetto. And Theresienstadt was used, the Red Cross visited. It was used as a way of disabusing the world that a genocide was taking place. From early Polish ghettos, which was simply to control as many Jews as possible and to make sure that the Nazi authorities were in control. Before ghettoization, many Jews escaped across the Eastern Front. So it was a way of just stopping Jews from escaping. There were all kinds of policies that were discussed. They were thinking of making a large ghetto in Eastern Poland, a Reich ghetto, to house the vast majority of Jews in Poland. They were the Madagascar scheme to expel Jews to Madagascar. There were all kinds of schemes, but in the end, during wartime, it was simply impossible. And so these ghettos that we use as a form of management after Wannsee became part of the Holocaust and part of the genocide. In between February 1942 and March 1943, so in just over a year, 3 million Jews were killed, and that and certainly the ghettos and the Warsaw Ghetto was part of that genocide, and that's why so many Jews were deported from the Warsaw Ghetto. Once the Nazis invaded Eastern Poland and the Soviet Union, ghettos were primarily just part of the Holocaust, part of the genocide. They were places where Jews quite often were massacred before ghettoization. They were placed, they weren't walled in, they weren't sealed in. It was barbed wire that was used mainly, and that's why there was more forms of resistance in the Soviet Union, and Jews did resist and join the partisans and smuggle in food and all kinds of resistance. But the Germans were simply massacring them. Within a year, I think, of Operation Barbarossa, 1 million Jews were killed in all forms. It wasn't necessarily deportation to the death camps, but in all ways. It was really terrible killing fields. It was what one historian calls bloodlands, and they were bloodlands for sure. So these ghettos were used primarily for the genocide, for to aid the Holocaust. So as I say, ghettos had different functions at different times.
Now, talking of which, let's broaden this out a bit, because there is the question about what is a ghetto in historical terms, because there are so many different times and places where there have been ghettos. What does the term actually mean, and when were the first ghettos in Europe?
Well, the first ghettos, and the first ghetto, and I'm sure many of you have visited Venice, was in Venice. And it was part of Venetian dialect, ghetto, gettare, meaning to pour. And it was an island on the northern edge of Venice, an old copper factory, and the pouring comes from molten metal. And that was the first ghetto, 1516. So a few years ago, there was the 500th anniversary of the Venetian ghetto, and it has become very much part of Venetian history.
So there were no medieval ghettos?
What there were in medieval Europe and also in North Africa as well were Jewish quarters. The difference is that the Venetian ghettos were compulsory, they were secured, and it was impossible to escape. They were also, Jews were forced to live in ghettos. So they were forced enclosures. The Jewish quarters were different. They weren't locked from the outside in, but from the inside out. Jews tended to stay in ghettos for a number of reasons, two main reasons. One, because they feared if they were tradespeople, then there was all kinds of violence between different guilds, Christian guilds and Jewish tradespeople. So it was a way of securing themselves. So they locked themselves from the inside. They were also built around synagogues, communal life. They were thought of as holy communities quite often. Kahila Kadosha. They were holy communities. In the Italian ghettos, many of them were called New Jerusalems. The main difference is the word, that they were called ghettos in Italy, and the fact that they were compulsory, they were segregated, and they were enforced. That's the hard definition of ghettoization: compulsory, segregated, and enforced.
So there's two very different policies, if you can call them policies, in the late Middle Ages, early modern period. On the one hand, Jews are expelled from England, from Spain, from Portugal, famously. On the other hand, in other places, they're just kept in the country, but segregated from their Christian fellow citizens.
Absolutely. Most people think of ghettos at this time, and it's over a 300-year period, from about 1516 until Napoleon liberated the ghettos at the end of the 18th century.
And so this is called the Age of the Ghetto.
And it's the Age of the Ghetto. It's called the Age of the Ghetto. I think Cecil Roth, the great Anglo-Jewish popularizer, called them the Age of the Ghetto, and I've gone along with that. I think that's correct. But it's assumed that they were just bad. They weren't, not at all. First of all, ghettoization in Italy was a compromise. As you said, the vast majority of Western Europe expelled their Jews. There are a few notable exceptions. Frankfurt and Prague are the two main exceptions, a few other German cities as well. But the vast majority of Jews were expelled in Western Europe. Ghettoization in Italy was a compromise. So the Italian states, and there were many states, it was not a homogenous nation, far from it. Spain ruled bits of Italy, France ruled bits of Italy, the Catholic Church, Rome ruled bits of Italy, Venice itself was a city-state. So they, though, were becoming weaker. So ghettoization was both a compromise and it was a form of, it was a product of weakness, that the Italian empires were weakening largely because of the rise of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was taking a lot of lands, a lot of trade from the Italians. The Catholic Church also had to face the Reformation. So the Reformation was changing the world for Catholics as well, and weakening the Catholic Church. So it was a product of weakness that they needed Jews to stay. They couldn't afford to expel them in the way that other Western nations and the vast majority of Western European nations did. They stayed, ghettos were not prisons. There was a lot of interchange between the Jewish population and the Catholic population, a lot of trade between them. The authorities valued them in two main ways: one, for local taxation, and two, as tradespeople that could trade across the Ottoman Empire, go back to Spain and Portugal, and more trade with Western Europe as well. So Jews were valued in bringing in taxation, bringing in trades, and were allowed to gain degrees. There were more Jewish scientists in the age of the ghetto than in the age of the Renaissance, for instance. The cultural life was incredibly rich in terms of Kabbalah, Talmudic study, in terms of the autonomy of women within the ghetto was also very strong. Ghettos also were a product, so they were a product of modernity insofar as I've said, mercantile trade, taxation, women's autonomy, also urban planning as well. Places like Florence, the center of Florence was built around urban planning, which included a brand new ghetto. Lots of Italian cities were modernized through the ghetto. So the ghetto was a product of modernity.
Sorry, if I can just interrupt 1 second.
Yeah.
One of the things that I found most interesting in your book was how you take these early ghettos and then you look later on how how these became an object of fascination for writers. For in German, in French, in British, in English, that people started writing about the ghetto, and they had a particular set of sort of images of the ghetto, if you like.
Absolutely. First of all, the kind of reality I've talked about, that ghettos were part of modernity, this was in the 19th century, the ghettos of the imagination. So in short, the ghettos moved eastwards. So shtetls eventually, through the German language, were renamed, and this was a name imposed on them, ghettos. They also moved westwards. So 250,000 German Jews emigrated to the United States and brought the word ghetto with them. It was in German popular culture that they reimagined the ghetto. And the ghetto was no longer in Italy, and the word came from Italy, but was no longer in Italy. It was on the eastern borders of the German nation. It was in Central Europe that the ghetto was seen to be, and German writers wrote about the ghetto in those terms. What Jewish writers did was use the ghetto to re-establish Jewish values, to see it as a place of spirituality, a place where Jews gained a form of respectability. It fitted in very well with the kind of rising middle class values. It was also a way of imagining a unified Germany, which was very popular at the time. So ghettos were rural, not urban, in this imagination. So this whole European tradition of the imaginary ghetto started in Germany, was translated into English in the 1860s and 1870s, also into French in the 1840s and 50s, and into most languages, Yiddish included, throughout the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, you had someone like Israel Zangwill, who we know very well, who wrote The Children of the Ghetto, which was a bestseller both in the United Kingdom and the United States, and published first in the United States. He read all of this literature, mainly in translation, and negotiated, if you like. He was a kind of mediator between this imaginary ghetto and what he called actual ghettos in the East End of London and in other cities in Britain, made up, of course, of East European immigrants. And so Children of the Ghetto, in Zangwill's terms, moves from the past to the present and moves from the rural parts of Europe to urban, to the city, right in the middle of cities. And so he popularized the term ghetto. So by the 1890s, Children of the Ghetto became a Broadway show. Other East European immigrants, most famously Abraham Kahan, befriended Zangwill, went to these Broadway shows, saw all the reviews of them, read his novels, and applied the term ghetto to the Lower East Side.
And your book sort of, it doesn't quite end with, but follows another extraordinary move, which is how in 1960s America, you get writers like James Baldwin, you get people like Martin Luther King talking about the Black ghetto. And Elvis Presley, of course, sang a very famous song in the ghetto.
Yes.
What is that about?
Well, I think what we have to understand about this history, which is 500 years, is that at any one time, you have different versions of the ghetto. So when it comes to the African-American ghetto, you have 3 different versions. Yes, they went back to Italy and talked about invisible walls, referring to the Italian ghetto. This was a phrase also used by Berlin Jews after the Nuremberg laws as well. So invisible walls. They also did look across to the Nazi ghettos and thought of ghettos as a form of racial oppression. And they also looked to urban ghettos, Chicago, Lower East Side, and most of the northern cities where the majority of Jews immigrated to from Eastern Europe. And I regard those as ethnic enclaves. But African Americans looked at these 3 different versions of the ghetto. And certainly by the 1960s, as you say, the term moved from Jewish history and Jewish experience to African American experience. I a few weeks ago just checked out Martin Luther King's speeches throughout the 1960s. He talked endlessly about the ghetto and about, as he would put it, using the word of his time, Negroes living in ghettos. So the African-American ghetto was something that was popularized in speeches, articles by Martin Luther King, and was taken up by many African-Americans. Now, this was because, and it's true to say, and I argue this in the book, the only American population that were actually ghettoized were African Americans from the 1920s until the 1970s. And by that, I mean the hard definition of ghettoization: compulsory, segregated, and enforced. They were not allowed to move out of these urban centers. They were not allowed to move to the suburbs. They were not allowed to move to better forms of housing because of the racism of local housing associations. They essentially formed a monopoly and drew up quasi-legal agreements which said that if any black people move into these areas or rent or sublet, we will have nothing to do with the housing agencies. Also, in terms of insurance, mortgages, it was really, really hard for African Americans to get a mortgage, to get housing insurance. So for 50 years, and in some cases much longer, African Americans were forced to live in a particular place, whether they liked it or not.
I have lots more questions. However, I'm aware that many in our audience will also have their own questions. So I'm going to pass you back to Susan and Deborah, who will ask some of those questions on our audience's behalf. Thank you so much for your time. Should there not be enough questions, and I've still got my long list here, so perhaps we'll come back to those later on.
Thanks so much, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Actually, to date, I've had one question. I can see a few people waving, so I'm going to read you the question that came through on chat, and then we'll hopefully go across and unmute. Vera, I can see you waving. I will come to you in a minute. Somebody said a naive question, but how could any population be believed that they claimed they not to know what was going on in the ghettos, i.e. in central Warsaw, and then there was the mass deportations?
Well, thank you. A really important question. Some Holocaust historians, and Raoul Hilberg wrote a book with this title, divides up the Holocaust into perpetrators, victims, and bystanders. And this has been disputed in recent years, and I think rightly so, because I think what the questioner rightly asks is, there's no such thing, certainly not in Warsaw, of being an innocent bystander. Bystanders knew exactly what was happening, not least because many Jews did, such as Janina Bauman, did managed to move out of the ghetto into areas, and this became an industry. There was all kinds of blackmail going on by the local population if Jews were known to be in hiding. Even to be in hiding in the first place, you certainly needed money, you needed to pay for the privilege of living. And there's no question that the whole of the Warsaw population knew exactly what was going on. And that's why the resistance had such a positive effect on the Polish resistance itself. And it did. And it's why after the January resistance, when Jews were seen to be able to resist, that the Polish Home Army actually supported the Jewish resistance actively. So there's no such thing as an innocent bystander. There's no such thing as someone that didn't know what was going on. Sadly, they knew full well what was going on.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to unmute Vera because I could see you waving away at me, Vera. Hi, hello.
Well, first of all, this was the most fascinating talk. I've learned so much, so thank you. And secondly, my husband was in one of these small ghettos. It was the Sosnowiec ghetto, and I've heard from him a lot about, what existence was like until he was the first in his family. They were working while they were in the ghetto, and he actually was making or helping to make uniforms for Rommel's army. And he was the first one taken away in his family while the others still were there to the camps. What I want to know is, when were all these very small ghettos like Sosnowiec, where they actually were living in a Jewish house in the most appalling, crowded, starving conditions. When were they all exterminated? The small ghettos like this, and people just were murdered or turned into big camps.
Yeah. First, two things. First of all, as someone who was working, that's tremendously important, because essentially if you weren't given a certificate as someone who could work, you were killed. So that is tremendously important. The ghettos we've been talking about, Lodz and Warsaw, were regional ghettos. So a ghetto like your husband was in was a much smaller ghetto and would have been amalgamated with these regional ghettos around 1941-42.
Oh, thank you.
So that's what would have happened. But if he had a certificate in terms of,
Yes.
as a worker, then that would have certainly meant that he wouldn't have been immediately deported.
No,
So
he was
that was the
deported
most.
in 1941, but he was the first in his family. So I wondered how long it existed as a ghetto after that.
Yes, I would say not that long. Certainly not by 1942. It certainly would have been.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vera. Another question from the audience via chat. Can you say more how the term ghetto is used in contemporary terms now?
Yeah. Thank you. That's really interesting. The last chapter of my book is called The Global Ghetto, and I try and understand how it's being used today. Because of my son, who's in his 20s, he could help me understand a bit of rap music and hip hop and that kind of thing. So it's very much part of African-American culture, African-American identity. And there's a kind of parallel that goes on. So just as Jews look to the East End of London in this country, where my father was born, and many of our relatives were born in these kind of urban ghettos, not just in London, in Manchester, all over the country, Birmingham, Liverpool, all over. So Jews think of these urban areas as ghettos. In fact, they weren't. They were urban enclaves. Jews were white ethnics, and the point is that after a generation, we were fortunate we could move out, and we did. So the term is mainly used by African Americans today, even though Jews still use it in relation to these ethnic enclaves, and of course in relation to the Nazi ghettos. So I think for Jews, it's the Nazi ghettos that still cast a shadow over our history and our identity. For African Americans, it's there's still a very large urban underclass. So what happened in the 1970s in America was that these kind of racist practices of not enabling them to move, after the riots of the 1960s, the summer riots for the decade of the 1960s, the federal government enabled middle-class African Americans to move to the suburbs. There's already white flight out of these areas, so wealthy Black American people also moved out of these areas as well. What were left were the poorest of the poor, the underclass. So much of the fashion, many films, many songs are all about these areas that still sadly very much exist in large American cities, in Chicago, in parts of Washington, in parts of New York State. So those are the two main ways they're used. Soweto thought that it could describe itself as a ghetto, and did describe itself as a ghetto. And the reason it did that in South Africa was because it thought it would be a way of gaining tourism. The local population, though, rejected the term ghetto because they just thought it was imposed from North America. But there is a kind of, because we're in a kind of global culture, there is a link between the kind of music and films and fashion and culture that comes out of these American cities that has gone global and does go global. So poor Black people in South Africa, in all parts of the world, can adopt the term ghetto. But I have to say, the term ghetto is used primarily in the German language and the English language, much less so in French and Spanish, who have their own terms for these slum areas. So it's mainly German and English.
Okay, thank you, Bryan. I'm just going to, I've had one more question that's just come in. I'm just going to ask that, and then I will hand back to David to wrap up, which is somebody asking if you know if there were any transports from Warsaw Ghetto to Dachau in 1942.
No, I don't believe so. I think in 1942, as David said, it was primarily Treblinka. 700,000 people were killed in 10 weeks in Treblinka from Warsaw. It was the most, David Cesarani, who you'll know through the great director of the Wiener Library, the late great David Cesarani, called Treblinka the most lethal place on earth at the time. After Treblinka, Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau from Warsaw.
Right. Thank you. David, I'm going to hand back to you to wrap up. Thank you both for your time. Thank you to the audience for joining us. A recording of this will be on the AJR's YouTube. It takes about a week to upload it, but I shall hand back to you, David, for the final thanks. And Bryan, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And I just wanted to say, Bryan, that I'd like to make very clear that the book is a fascinating mixture. It's not just history, but it's also very interesting. Yes, wave it, show it with pride. That it is a fascinating mixture of history and literary criticism, that it covers 500 years of history, that it covers an enormous amount of geography from Italy, from Nazi-occupied Russia, across to America. It's a fascinating read, and I hope our conversation gave us a flavor of the book. And it's published by OUP in their very short introduction series. And all it leaves me to do is to thank you, Bryan, for all your time and for such an interesting conversation today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you, Susan and Deborah, for organizing this as well. And the AJR, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Lovely, thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Take care, and we'll see you later in the week, I'm sure.